will be introduced by verbs or words and connected with seeing and vision. Hence the word seer as a designation for a prophet also. Yes. Amos is shown visions of various kinds, particularly those 5 visions clumped in chapters 7, 8, and 9. And this is true of the prophets generally. These visions might be visions of God speaking or visions of God performing some kind of action. They might also be visions of perfectly ordinary objects or events that carry some sort of symbolic significance. So we have 5 visions in Amos in chapters 7 through 9, and some of them are visions of ordinary objects, but those objects have some special coded meaning or symbolic significance for Israel. And then we have visions of extraordinary things as well. So we have a locust plague. It's about to consume the crop right after the king has taken his share, his taxes of the crop. Not such an extraordinary vision. But then there's a vision of a fire that consumes the lower waters that are pressed down below the earth and which threatens to consume even the soil, the earth itself. So it's an extraordinary vision. We have a vision of the plumb line, right? The tool that's used by builders. There's a vision of God destroying worshipers in the temple. The vision in chapter 8 is an ordinary vision. It's a vision of a basket of summer fruit. The Hebrew word for summer or summer fruit is kaitz. And this is a pun because the word kaitz means end. So the vision of kaitz is indicating or symbolizing the ketz, the end of Israel. And these kinds of symbolic visions will very often typically include puns of this type. So another point to make about just the literary features of prophetic writings is that they do contain or employ a variety of literary forms. One commonplace form that you will see over and over again in these writings is a form that we call the oracle, an oracle against the nations. This is found in Amos. It's found also in the 3 large prophetic writings, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. Amos 1 and 2 contains 7 of these oracles that inveigh against the nations. But Amos gives the form a new twist, and this is what's interesting. 6 of the 7 oracles are directed against surrounding nations, and they are excoriated for their inhumane treatment of others, Israelite and non-Israelite, during wars and conflicts. As punishment for their terrible war atrocities, a divine fire is going to break out and destroy all of their palaces and fortified places. But then the twist comes, because after these 6 horrific oracles which condemn the nations for these brutal acts of atrocity and war, Amos then turns to address his own people. And he says the same divine power will consume the people of Yahweh because of the atrocities and inhumanities that they commit even in times of peace. So the 7th, the climactic oracle, announces that God's wrath will be directed at Israel. And this is a very unwelcome, unexpected statement. And you can see how he perhaps would almost draw his audience in, by with these images of their enemies getting what they deserve, only to then turn it around, having drawn them in, seduce them, if you will, with his words, to turn around and then charge them with something even worse. The term Israel that he uses is, of course, ambiguous. That's one of the problems with some of the prophetic writings. You're never completely sure whether they're prophesying against the northern kingdom, Israel, or the house of Israel, right? Both kingdoms together, the whole tribal confederation. Some passages in Amos would suggest one, some passages suggest the other. The other thing that we find in Amos is an oracle against Judah, against the southern kingdom. This is in chapter 2. It's just 2 lines, verses 4 and 5, and it's in chapter 2. And many people identify that as a later addition by an editor. First of all, it's written in very standard sort of Deuteronomistic language. And also, if we leave it out, then we have a nice literary pattern. We have 6 oracles, right, plus 1. We have 6 oracles against foreign nations, and then we have 1 against Israel. And that pattern is a very standard literary pattern, particularly in poetic sections of the Bible, and the prophets are written in an elevated poetic style. We very often have a 6 plus 1 pattern. That's related to another pattern that we also see in Amos, which is the 3 plus 1 pattern. Right? This is just a doubling of it, 6 plus 1. The 3 plus 1 pattern you'll recognize, it's quite explicit at times. Amos will say, for 3 transgressions of Damascus, for 4 I will not revoke it, the decree of punishment. Right? The similar kind of language is used in verse 6 for Gaza, in verse 9 for Tyre, in verse 11 for Edom, in verse 13 for the Ammonites, and so on. So we often have this pattern. And so the suggestion by scholars is that without that prophecy concerning the fall of Judah, which postdates Amos, you would have a nice complete 6+1 pattern. And this might be the sign of a later editor updating Amos's prophecy so that it would look as though he had in fact prophesied the fall of Judah. You have other sorts of literary patterns and forms used in the prophetic works. Some of the literary forms we see are hymns, we see songs, we see laments, particularly laments or mourning for Israel as if her destruction is already a fait accompli. You find proverbs. Very often when the prophets cite a proverb, they will turn its accepted meaning on its head. They'll take an old proverb and they'll apply it to some new situation and give it a radically new kind of meaning to sort of shock and surprise their audience. And Amos 3 through 8 contains a lot of proverbs. Another literary form that we'll see, and this is an important one, is a literary form that's called the Riv, R-I-V, I have it up there. A Riv, which basically means a lawsuit, specifically a covenant lawsuit. Many of the prophetic books feature passages in which God basically brings a lawsuit against the people, charging them with breach of covenant, breach of contract, if you will. And in these passages, you have legal metaphors being used throughout, right? People testifying or witnessing against Israel. Can she speak in her defense? And so on. So the Riv, or the covenant lawsuit, is a form we'll see here. We'll also see it again when we get to the book of Job. So the prophetic corpus draws on the entire range of literary forms that were available in Israelite tradition, literary tradition, and very often gives them a rich, and that's what gives the books a very rich and varied texture. So Amos is a model for us in terms of its literary features, but it's also a model for us in terms of some of the themes or the content of the book, because Amos will articulate certain themes that we will see resounding throughout the prophetic literature. There will be some variations on these themes, but some standard themes appear here. So we'll review those now. Many scholars, Kaufman among them, have noted that the literature of the classical prophets is most clearly and strongly characterized by a vehement denunciation of the moral decay and social injustice of the period. It really doesn't matter what period. Vehement denunciation of moral decay and social injustice is the way Kaufman phrases it. Amos criticizes the sins of the nation. He's critical of everyone, the middle class, the government, the king, the establishment, the priesthood. They're all plagued by a superficial kind of piety. For Amos, as for all the prophets we'll be looking at, the idea of covenant prescribes a particular relationship with Yahweh, but not only with Yahweh, also with one's fellow human beings, right? The two are interlinked. It's a sign of closeness to Yahweh that one is concerned for Israel's poor and needy, right? The two are completely intertwined and interlinked. And so Amos denounces the wealthy, he denounces the powerful, and the way they treat the poor. I'm going to be reading some passages from Amos to illustrate some of these themes. So Amos chapter 4, verses 1 to 3. And listen to the dramatic rhetoric that's used. Hear this word, you cows of Bashan on the hill of Samaria. It's the capital of the northern kingdom, Israel. Who defraud the poor, who rob the needy, who say to your husbands, bring and let's carouse. My Lord God swears by his holiness, behold, days are coming upon you when you will be carried off in baskets, and to the last one in fish baskets, and taken out of the city, each one through a breach straight ahead, and flung on the refuse heap. It's a wonderful pun here because the wealthy women of Samaria are referred to as cows of Bashan. Now, Bashan is an area that's very rich pasture land in the Transjordan. And also, it's very common in Canaanite literature to refer to the nobility and even to gods with terms like bull or ram or cow. These were not insulting terms, as they might be in our culture. These were, in fact, terms that did not offend. These were very complimentary terms. So when he refers to the cows of Bashan, he speaks to the women of Samaria as the cows of Bashan, he's flattering them to begin with. But the pun is quite wonderful because these women are going to end up like fat cows, as slabs of meat in the butcher's basket or in the fish basket, which is flung out on the refuse heap once it's spoiled, right? So he takes that term, cows of Bashan, and leads it to this horrendous end. Amos Amos 6, verse 1 and verses 4 through 7. This is another scathing attack on the idle life of the carefree rich who ignore the plight of the poor. Woe to those at ease in Zion, of course that's the capital of the southern kingdom, Jerusalem, and those confident on the hill of Samaria, the northern kingdom, you notables of the leading nation, on whom the house of Israel pin their hopes. They lie on ivory beds, lolling on their couches, feasting on lambs from the flock and on calves from the stalls. They hum snatches of song to the tune of the lute. They account themselves musicians like David. They drink straight from the wine bowls and anoint themselves with the choicest oils. But they are not concerned about the ruin of Joseph. Assuredly, right soon they shall head the column of exiles. They shall loll no more at festive meals. It's a great image of them lying about as the head of the nation. Well, they'll be at the head of the nation as it moves into exile. And on an archaeological note, I understand that in Samaria they have in fact uncovered all kinds of ivory furniture and ivory coverings that would then be attached to furniture. So the image of them lolling on ivory couches in Samaria apparently makes a lot of sense. So the moral decay, the greed, the indulgence of the upper classes, this is directly responsible for the social injustice that, according to the prophets, outrages God. Amos 8, 4 through 6. Listen to this, you who devour the needy, annihilating the poor of the land, saying, oh, if only the new moon were over so that we could sell grain, the Sabbath so that we could offer wheat for sale, using a measure that is too small and a shekel weight that is too big, tilting a dishonest scale and selling grain refuse as grain. We will buy the poor for silver, the needy for a pair of sandals. The Lord swears by the pride of Jacob, I will never forget any of these doings. Again, notice that they are prone to extreme formulations and high-flown rhetoric. And sometimes when you strip away the rhetoric, you see that the crimes that are being denounced are not murder and rape or horrendous physical violence. These are obvious and grievous violations of social morality. Rather, many scholars have pointed out, but I think Kaufman chief among them, that the crimes that are denounced here are crimes that are prevalent in any society, in any era. The crimes that are denounced as being utterly unacceptable to God, infuriating God to the point of destruction of the nation, are the kinds of crimes we see around us every day. Taking bribes, improper weights and balances, lack of charity to the poor, indifference to the plight of the debtor. A second theme that's pointed out again by many scholars is what Kaufman calls the idea of the primacy of morality. That is to say, the idea or the doctrine that morality is not just an obligation equal in importance to the cultic or religious obligations, but that morality is perhaps superior to the cult. What God requires of Israel is morality and not cultic service. Now, the prophets are all going to have, we're going to see many different attitudes towards the cult among the prophets, so allow that to become a more nuanced statement as we go through. Some are going to reject the cult of the entire nation, others will not, so there's going to be some variation, but certainly morality is primary. And their words could at times be very harsh and very astonishing. Amos 5, verses 21 to 24. I loathe, he's speaking now as God, right? So God is speaking, and God says, I loathe, I spurn your festivals. I am not appeased by your solemn assemblies. If you offer me burnt sacrifices or your meal sacrifices, I will not accept them. I will pay no heed to your gifts of fatlings. Spare me the sound of your hymns, and let me not hear the music of your lutes, but let justice well up like water, righteousness like an unfailing stream. This is an attack on empty piety, on the performance of rituals without any meaning, perhaps, behind that performance, or in accompaniment to social injustice, right? That the two can't happen at the same time. And that's a theme that is sounded repeatedly throughout prophetic literature. So for Amos and for all the prophets, injustice is sacrilege. The ideals of the covenant are of utmost importance, right? That's why they are called the standard bearers of the covenant, harking back to the covenant obligations. And without the ideals of the covenant, the fulfillment